Staying with us now, let's start the conversation on taking a look at the Constitution 6 years on. Of course, it was promulgated in 2010. What are some of the gains made? What are some of the issues still in implementing it and seeing it come to full fruition? With me in studio now is Cyprian Nyamamu. He is with the Future of Kenya Foundation. We also have Chisoni Atsango Chisoni. She's the former deputy chair of the Committee of Constitutional Experts, and Honorable Nicholas Gumbo. He is the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. Thank you all for joining me. Cyprian, let me start with you. Last year was a very critical time in terms of the implementation of the Constitution. Some things were meant to take place and happen. They did not. And why is that?
Thank you very much, Victoria. And as we mark the 6th year of the promulgation of the Constitution, at the 5th year last year, there were things that were supposed to have been done and were not yet done. They have not, some of them have not been done up to this day. You can sum it up that the country has a constitution without constitutionalism. There's no culture of constitutionalism. Generally, the institutions of the state do not want to uphold and promote the values of the Constitution in Article 10, and that is exactly where the problem is. Mm-hmm. And for me, there are only 3 issues that I want to raise as we get on the 6th anniversary. One is that there's non-implementation. Secondly, is that we have very weak institutions that almost seem like they don't have leadership. And I will name some of them at a later time. And thirdly, is that there is impunity. What will you do even if we don't do it? Right. What will you do anyway? Now, so those 3 for me are at the core of the gloom that is happening in Kenya, even with the new constitution.
Because in 2015, there was supposed to be some enabling legislation put in place. What exactly was that legislation?
Correct. And Asango is our expert, and she will speak at a great detail into that. But when you go to the schedule in the constitution in terms of what was supposed to have been implemented by now, particular enabling legislation on, for example, implementing the 2/3, implementing Article 100 on minorities, persons with disability, marginalized communities, etc. A lot of these laws that were supposed to be in place by last year were not in place, and Parliament requested for an extension of 1 year, for example, on the 2/3, but the impunity with which Parliament operates, even the cabinet and the leadership of His Excellency the President, is really worrisome. This is the impunity with which
the executive and the legislature
completely
have been roadblocks.
Completely. So there was a bit of transactional legislation that was brought to bear at the early stages of the Constitution, but the critical ones about enabling spaces of the marginalized, majorities have not been put in place up to this time.
Okay, before I get to you, Atsango, Honorable, what is your reaction to what Cyprian just said in terms of the legislation or legislature being a hindrance in the implementation of the Constitution?
Well, to some extent, thank you, Victoria, for the opportunity to be here on the show. To some extent, it is correct, yes. I agree that largely the Constitution, if you like, the milestones that we were supposed to have achieved now largely remain a work in progress, which is unfortunate. Of course, you look at it, it's not just the legislature alone, the executive, and to some extent even the judiciary. There's been what you call, personally I would call collective will by the people of Kenya. I've argued on the floor of the House that sometimes when a society needs, the more laws a society needs, really sometimes is a manifestation of perversity of nobility. What do I mean by this? You look at our Constitution. In fact, the provisions of the preamble alone, if we were to live by the provisions of the preamble alone, this society would be such a perfect. Look at what the preamble states. It starts from what we did to gain independence, what we ought to do as a country to recognize and appreciate each other, how much space we need to give it. Are we doing it?
Right.
Look at even chapter 12 on the values and principles of public service. It's flouted every day. Right. No one seems to care. Sometimes when you question it, you are told, but he is a qualified. Of course, he is a qualified Kenyan, but we recognize that as a country, look at where we have come. There's quite a number of us who have been left behind. Do we just disregard them because Gumbo has a degree in engineering and he qualifies? There is an opportunity for somebody who has a degree in engineering. You don't think about those of us who are living behind. And here in Victoria, for me, lies the danger. Every society ought to know that the more people you leave behind, you give them no option than to take down those who are leaving them behind. It has been shown all over the world, and I think that is what, for me, is a bigger concern. But yes, the truth is, largely, there has been lack of constitutionalism in this country. There's been minimal progress. Of course, if you look at, for example, in the outlying areas of Kenya, I'm very impressed, and I want to say here, like what's happening in what you call the former northern frontier, like Wajir, Governor Abdullahi, for the first time in 50 years. I've spoken about it, and even with reference to the highly acclaimed session of paper number 5 of 1965, which divided Kenya into low production areas and high production areas, which is the reason really why some of the parts of Kenya have been, it's so much. You look at, they've been left behind so much. So I think constitutionalism still is a problem in this country.
I mean, Atsango, do you agree with honorable sentiments that a lack of constitutionalism is lacking? You said also a lack of implementation is also a huge headache in seeing a lot of the gains that we want to see from the Constitution come forth.
I think I agree with both Cyprian and Honorable Gumbo, that our fundamental problem is that we are now in the area of culture change, really. And we've had one culture of constitutionalism, which was in a sense a negative culture, where we were used to breaking the law, where we didn't respect the law, where we related to the law as alien. So when we enacted the new constitution, because our dominant culture was one where we don't have respect for rule of law, we continue with that, and it will take time to actually change the way in which we respond. Just in relation to what Honorable Gumbo had just raised about how the more laws you need, that was one of the critiques when the Constitution was being drafted. Right. Why does it need to be so detailed? People would say things like the American Constitution is so short. Why does ours have all these articles? Precisely because we have a culture where we do not respect those values and principles. Right. All these values and principles are summed up in the preamble, in Article 10. They're further re-enunciated in different chapters.
Right. Yeah. Right. And in terms of just seeing the implementation happen, what do you think were the hindrances? Why are we seeing such an issue in people really embracing the Constitution in very critical bodies such as the constitutional bodies like the IEBC, AACC, a lot of these collapsing when it comes to carrying out their mandate as envisioned in the Constitution?
With all due respect to the Kenyan people have handed over the task of enforcing their Constitution to people who were honest about the fact that they didn't care for it. Okay. So I don't see how they expected those who were opposed to it to implement it.
And what's your take on that, Cyprian? How do we now fix that? Because now we're talking about what we have missed in terms of the Constitution 6 years on.
Thank you very much. I think this is a great opportunity for the people of Kenya to realize that the watchmen and the people they have given the duty to take care of their interests are not doing it. And there are two possibilities. There are two choices that we have to make. Actually, there are two strategies that we have to use. One of the strategies is what I want to call the civic strategy. The civic strategy means that families and villages have to rise up, deepen voice, and speak out for what matters most to them. That's the civic strategy. The second one is a monitoring and evaluation strategy where citizens have to monitor each and every organ, every institution, and every public officer, from the chief in the village. By the way, the chiefs were supposed to be going and they have not gone because that's what the Constitution required, so that every institution has to be monitored, has to be evaluated whether it is performing. I'll just give one example about the monitoring and evaluation strategy, which I think is very important. For example, the number of extrajudicial killings that have been happening in this country is really a mockery and a suspension of the Constitution in all intents and purposes. And you know, we have to now realize that Parliament and the other institutions that are supposed to watch over the police are not going to do it without the people stepping forward to help the institutions to monitor them.
That's been a missing element, is the people taking ownership of their power and influence through the Constitution.
That's the civic strategy.
Okay.
And really Parliament is what has failed this country. To be very honest, Parliament has three broad roles. It has an oversight role, Parliament has a legislative role, and Parliament has a representative role. Now, what has happened is that Parliament has only taken on one role, which is legislation. And a lot of those legislations have actually been questioned for their sincerity and genuineness to advance the interests of the people. But let's just grant that Parliament has been doing legislation. They have passed many legislations. But when it comes to the role of oversight over the executive, here Parliament has scored less than 16%. Parliament has performed so badly, and Ogumbo is the chair of the Parliamentary Accounts Committee. Right. The oversight role of Parliament has been dismal. And when it comes to the representing the interests of the people, this has been missing. If you see the kind of price that is being put on commodities, which make Article 43 impossible to achieve when we come to the social and economic rights. Right. Access to healthcare, access to water, access to food is not possible when Parliament is not ensuring that there's oversight. There's this tyranny of numbers that has been spoken about, which has actually translated members of Parliament to be representative of political parties and party leaders and not the interests of the people. Right. So the representation role and the role of oversight is what has to be awakened. Otherwise, we are going to perish as a nation.
So, Honorable Gumbo, do you agree?
Well, I think...
are you self-serving in your legislation?
I think he's overgeneralized, with all due respect to Cyprian. He's somebody I respect, but I think so far as he's talked about it, you have to understand, Victoria, that Parliament has to work within the law. And Parliament in itself, if Parliament takes the role of executing, then it is now encroaching on the executive. I'll give you an example. He has mentioned Public Accounts Committee. In our report on the judiciary, we have made specific recommendations on individuals who should not hold public office. That report was passed by Parliament. Nothing has happened. We have made specific recommendations on companies that ought not to do business based on evidence that we received with government, which should be investigated and should be blacklisted. And these are some of the owners of these companies are the who is who in this country.
But you're also chairing a committee that is also having to redeem its image
Absolutely.
after the former team was sent
Absolutely.
home of allegations
Absolutely.
of corruption.
Absolutely. But I will encourage all of you, if you've not read it, read the report that we did on the JSC and the judiciary. And this was after we had received a lot of evidence. Then we went to the IEBC and the 2013 elections. That report is public because it has been tabled before Parliament. Look at how we have arrived at insisting on, for example, that some members of the Commission ought to be subjected to lifestyle audit based on evidence we received, and this evidence is very clear in the report. So really, to say that Parliament has not, well, yes, I know we could have done better. But to say generally that Parliament has performed at 18%, it may not necessarily be correct.
No, it seems that a lot of the legislation is self-serving. We've seen the issue of party hopping being a big issue in Parliament now. And that seems to, of course, to benefit the members of Parliament and others who want to...
I wouldn't, of course, if I did comment, it would be subjective and I wouldn't want. But I think you did realize that the Speaker allowed an amendment on that based on the constitutional principle of that, of the aspect, if you call it. It's not actually being called party hopping, but it's being called changing parties. But it was looked at and it was seen to be violating certain tenets of the Constitution. And I don't think it will be right that merely because it is affecting members of Parliament, we shut our eyes to the fact that it is an affront on the Constitution and disregard it. But yes, we could have done better. Look, earlier on, when this 11th Parliament started, some of us voiced concern. One of the first laws that came to Parliament, perhaps people have forgotten, was the VAT Amendment Act. We, as the opposition, said, no, there's some things you cannot subject to VAT. Who were the first people to riot? They were rioting in Gatundu. Some people were brazen enough to say that we in CORD are the ones who had incited them. Right. How do we incite people in Gatundu? Because we were simply saying, if, for example, you apply VAT on animal feeds, then it becomes impossible for our farmers to be able to produce eggs. Simple things that make Kenyans move along. But this was not, people were saying we have to look at both the demand side and the supply side of things. If the demand side is taken care of, then the supply side will take care of itself. But we're looking at it globally and saying, no, this is not going to work in this economy. We had to relook at that law. Who spearheaded the law to relooking at the VAT law? It was us, the opposition. After we had seen that what had been pushed through the so-called tyranny of numbers was not good for Kenya and was not workable.
Okay, let me finish with you, Sango. We're running out of time, but just in terms of really seeing the positive side of this constitution and the gains, 81% of Kenyans who were interviewed in the InfoTrack poll said that devolution was a big gain. What's your take on that, and how can we really see the fruits out of that come out?
I think my message to the Kenyan people is very simple. This is our constitution. We voted for it. I think that really, as a people, we have an obligation to ourselves to ensure that it's respected. And we have a responsibility to hold accountable anybody that does not respect the Constitution. Article 3 of the Constitution gives us that power. Any one of us as an individual can go to court. We all have a responsibility to uphold the Constitution. I particularly appeal to the middle class because you're educated, you can read and write. Every single middle class Kenyan should read the Constitution and know the Constitution. This business of us assigning to somebody else the responsibility of ensuring that the Constitution is respected is precisely what is killing it. Right. And so I would say that we need to start holding people to account for those principles. If we see people who we've given our vote to disrespecting the Constitution, go and vote for somebody else. Right. Stand up for office if you think that you can do a better job. We need more people to stand up when we see that things are going wrong and say no to it. The politicians at the end of the day are a small minority. Even if we put all of them together, I don't think they exceed 10,000. Right. We're a nation of 40 million plus today.
45.
Yeah. So we have no excuses. We can replace anybody that is not respecting us, because they dishonor and respect us when they disrespect the Constitution. And every single person who is holding an elective office is a state officer under the Constitution. They swore to uphold it. Anybody who is appointed into the judiciary, into a constitutional commission, is a state officer. They swore to uphold the Constitution. So send them home until we get the people that will respect us as a society and will put the country's interests first. So I think the politicians are doing what they're doing because the people of Kenya have allowed them to get away with it.
I frankly put,
no, they're not informed. They have refused to demand something better. We have accepted mediocrity as citizens of this country. So we need to make our choices about what we want in terms of the quality of life.
All right, that wraps up our conversation. Thank you so much, Cyprian, Atsango, and Honorable Gumbo. That's all the time that we have. And of course, a lot more needs to be done. Of course, the central message that seems to be coming out of here is giving the power back to the people to see the Constitution do what it was meant to do when you wrote it 6 years ago.